it's a pleasure to introduce this penultimate session, which has a lot more to do with later alchemy and with pharmacology and with reenactment. Our first speaker is Gerasimos Merianos, who's a senior researcher at the Institute of Historical Research of the National Hellenic Research Foundation in Athens. And his work focuses on social and economic history of Byzantium and the history of science, with a particular emphasis on Byzantine alchemy.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conference. And with no further ado, I'm starting. The value of replicating ancient, medieval, and early modern recipes and technical texts from archaeometallurgy to cooking seems self-evident. And in many ways it is. Yet for those who have actually attempted it, the process is anything but straightforward. It is full of trials and errors, frustration and surprises, but ultimately it is also adventurous and profoundly rewarding, even when none of our initial hypotheses are confirmed. Let me begin by noting that at present, two major research teams have worked specifically on the replication of Greek alchemical recipes. By Greek alchemical recipes, I refer to those transmitted in the Leiden X and Stockholm alchemical papyri, as well as those preserved in the manuscripts that make up the Greek alchemical corpus, to avoid any misunderstandings. The older of the two teams is based in Mainz, Germany, and focuses on the collection of goldsmithing recipes found in Byzantinus Graecus 2327, entitled On the Most Noble and Illustrious Art of the Goldsmith, which is currently being prepared for edition. I participate in this team as a partner. The second team works from Bologna and originated with the ERC project Alchemist, led by Matteo Martelli. Both teams are interdisciplinary, bringing together specialists ranging from philology and the history of science to archaeometallurgy and chemistry. Today, I wish to share my experience as an amateur replicator, or rather interpreter, of what has been a sporadic yet fascinating engagement with the replication of alchemical recipes, and offer some remarks on the subject from my own perspective. I stress this, from my own perspective. This paper does not aim to provide a theoretical framework regarding the methodology, value, or challenges of replication. Its goal is more modest, to demonstrate, through personal examples, the value of engaging, even independently, with the practice of replication. Time permits me to speak in detail about only one example of hands-on engagement. After that, I will turn to a second case to illustrate the broader benefits of replication. My own involvement in replication began with a recipe from Leiden Papyrus X, specifically recipe number 87. This is not an obscure recipe among scholars concerned with the historical reproduction of alchemical texts. For instance, it is briefly described in Lawrence Principe's 2013 book, The Secrets of Alchemy, though naturally not in the level of detail I will present today. I initially chose this particular recipe because of its relatively quick execution. Ideally, it takes about an hour to complete, but it can yield astonishing results in slightly less time, although I must admit that this involves pushing the outcome a bit. Although this is not the only recipe I have replicated, I have even prepared cheese glue. Following an alchemical recipe, this particular one is well suited for public presentation, provided that the room is well ventilated, due to its rather unpleasant odor for most people. It smells like boiling mussels, and you will see why. It can be replicated without specialized equipment during an event, combining a lecture with a hands-on demonstration. Moreover, it produces a visually striking result that is relevant to both alchemy and counterfeiting techniques. Before I attempted to reproduce this recipe, I often felt that it was difficult to convince a general audience that alchemy was not about magic, spells, or incantations. On the other hand, even for those who accept that alchemy was part of scientific inquiry, always as measured by the standards of its time, it remains hard even to persuade them that its goals were not inherently chimerical or unfeasible. This recipe offers a concrete example around which one can build and communicate key aspects of the current scholarly consensus on Greek alchemy. The text of the recipe is as follows. The discovery of divine or sulfur water, I will explain this later. Mix 1 drachma of lime with an equal amount of previously ground sulfur in a vessel containing sharp vinegar, or we should call it something else, or the urine of a virgin boy. Apply heat from below until the resulting liquid takes on the appearance of blood. Filter to remove sediment and employ it clean. As you can see, the structure of the text strongly resembles that of a cooking recipe. But as is typical of pre-modern instructions, many fundamental parameters are missing. The recipe provides precise quantities for 2 ingredients, lime and sulfur. They should weigh 1 drachma each, approximately 3.4 grams, based on the weight of the drachma around 300 AD, and on the estimated fluctuation of the Roman libra at that date. However, it does not specify, for instance, how much vinegar or urine should be used. I should emphasize that urine, and I always use this, is more effective, preferably that of a boy. But after what we have heard earlier from Professor Photos Jones, this makes no surprise anymore. There is no indication of the level of heat to be applied, nor of how long the mixture should be heated. The only guiding sign is a visual one. The mixture should be heated until the liquid takes on the appearance of blood. But should we take this literally? Must it become vividly red, or is it a reddish hue sufficient? Even more striking is the lack of information regarding the use of the resulting solution. The recipe simply instructs us to use it clean, after filtering out the sediment, but offers no guidance on how it should be applied, to what, or for how long. There is no mention of a substance to be immersed or treated. The only elements made explicit are the name of the solution, divine or sulfur water, and its ingredients. To cut a long story short, the recipe is intended to make silver appear gold on its surface. This becomes evident when one considers the surrounding recipes in the papyrus, as well as the label divine or sulfur water itself. Theon Hedor in Greek is one of the well-known code names used by Greco-Egyptian and Byzantine alchemists. The word theon is ambiguous in Greek, meaning both divine as an adjective and sulfur as a noun, an ambiguity that aligns well with the deliberately cryptic character of such names. Yet these names are neither arbitrary nor nonsensical. This particular code name emphasizes the solution's dual nature, something which is very, very common with code names. It is divine and wondrous in terms of its extraordinary effects, but also sulfurous with reference to its key ingredient. Notably, there are several variations on how to produce divine water and which ingredients to use. The mention of divine water, thus, constitutes the second clue to the function of the recipe, as it is typically used in the coloring of metals. To appreciate the centrality of waters in Greco-Byzantine alchemy, one might consider a Middle Byzantine fragment preserved in several later manuscripts, the oldest of which is Parisinus Graecus 2327, copied in 1478, which was erroneously attributed to Zosimus of Panopolis by Berthelot and Ruel. Quote, the present book is called the Book on Metals and Hemepsis concerning chrysopoeia, argyropoeia, mercury solidification. It includes vapors, tinctures, and hollow molds of bronze. These are used for the counterfeiting of coins, as well as green stones, red stones, and all the other colors, and pearls, and the red dyeing of imperial leathers. All these are produced by waters and eggs by means of the metallurgical art. The connection between metallurgical art and alchemy is obvious in the fragment, But two sets of techniques emerge as characteristic of alchemy in particular. Waters, this is the symbol for waters, these wavy lines, okay, such as our divine or sulfur water, and the distillation of eggs, these are not eyes with an eyebrow, okay, whose products were likewise used in treating metals. To return to the recipe of the Leiden papyrus, the quantities of vinegar or urine are not specified. However, the amount of lime and sulfur suggests that the liquid component should be proportional in a way, not excessive, but sufficient to allow some evaporation during preparation and still permit immersion of objects in the final solution. From the sequence of the relevant images on the slides, one can observe various stages in both the production and application of the solution. And the result, if one is lucky, is this. It should be emphasized that the recipe is entirely devoid of mystical or philosophical language, an observation that aligns well with the strictly technical nature of the recipes found in the chemical papyri of Leiden and Stockholm, which reflect the earliest phase of Greco-Egyptian alchemy. Nevertheless, a particular moment during the replication of this recipe, based always on personal observation, resonated with the way alchemical ideas may have been received in what we might broadly describe as Christian contexts. This moment was the act of dipping a silver object into the solution for a short time. The object, as you can see here, is suspended by a cord. The duration required for the object to acquire a golden hue depends on several factors, such as the quantity and quality of urine, the level of heat, and so on. Typically, only a brief immersion is sufficient. Prolonged exposure causes the surface to take on coppery tones, turn brown, or in some cases even become cobalt blue. This process demands numerous trials and adjustments, as you can imagine. After the first attempt, it struck me that the act resembled a kind of baptism of the object into the solution. The linguistic connection between the verbs vapto, to dip, dye, or baptize, and baptizo, to dip, baptize, came vividly to mind, reminding me that the association between baptism and dyeing is quite natural in Greek. But for the first time, I conceived of it not as an abstract lexical point, but as something physically experienced. This helped me to better grasp, at least in my own thinking, why these verbs were so closely linked in alchemical discourse. This happens not only because baptizo is etymologically derived from vapto, but also because Christian concepts gave new and layered meanings to older terms. For instance, Régine Saron and Louis Pensot argue that the extracanonical Gospel of Philip, which has often been labeled as Gnostic or Valentinian, uses a baptismal metaphor that seems closely connected with alchemical descriptions of dyeing or chemical baptism. In this text, Christian baptism is depicted as a transfer of the quality of God's dyes, that is, immortality, to the baptized. It is well known that in Greco-Egyptian alchemical literature, the chemical art of dyeing is described as divine and as the very art of transformation. For me, this small gesture of dipping a silver object into a solution proved deeply illuminating. It helped me realize that beyond testing the feasibility of their outcomes, the replication of alchemical recipes can also reveal an often overlooked feature: their ability to verbally convey the visual dimension of alchemical processes. Recipe number 87 of the Leiden Papyrus X has helped me to convey to general audiences the chemical aspect of alchemy. For example, by explaining that what causes the gold patination is calcium polysulfides, not ingredients with occult powers. It has also allowed me to demonstrate the close connection between alchemy and counterfeiting. The solution, after all, is small in volume. One cannot immerse a silver basin or, let's say, a chandelier in it, only small objects. And what kinds of objects can be small among others? Jewelry, of course. This immediately suggests the link between alchemy and artisanal crafts, especially goldsmithing, and highlights how techniques from various technical fields came under the broader umbrella of alchemy. Equally important, this recipe allows me to show that alchemical equipment need not always be specialized or elaborate, like the alembics often depicted in manuscripts, or maybe as one has watched in a Harry Potter movie, but can also be everyday. For this reason, in public demonstrations, I prefer to use utensils from my own kitchen. While, let's say, a clay pot could be more historically accurate, a borosilicate pot allows the audience to observe the changing colors of the solution. This is why I consider recipes like this one ideal not only for educational and dissemination purposes, but also for offering valuable feedback to a historian of alchemy, as I hope to have shown so far. On the other hand, I truly recognize it, that in this case I do not apply strict methodological requirements typical of replications conducted in a laboratory. Up to this point, I have shared my experience of replicating a specific alchemical recipe primarily for educational purposes. In the remaining time, I would like to speak about my experience from the other side, receiving feedback from colleagues who are both experienced in replication and deeply knowledgeable in their fields. In 2019, during a visit to Mainz, the team of technical experts involved in the project I earlier referred to, together with Gunther Prinzing, head of the philological team, asked for my opinion on a particularly challenging passage from a recipe in the goldsmithing collection of Parisinus Graecus 2327. The recipe reads as follows: 2 ganose silver. Take sal ammoniac, zaparikon in the text, and iarin, dissolve them in vinegar and apply to the silver under the sun. It immediately turns black. If these are not available, smoke the silver with a small torch. The difficulty lies in the heading of the recipe, particularly in the verb ganose. The philological team initially maintained, and I must admit I also initially agreed, that the verb simply means to polish, a seemingly straightforward interpretation. Indeed, the verb gano commonly means to make bright or to polish, but it can also mean to tin or to lacquer. However, the technical team, who had already replicated the recipe, insisted correctly that interpreting ganose as to polish renders the heading inconsistent with the body of the recipe. The process described is not one of polishing or brightening. It involves blackening the silver, in one way or another. The question intrigued me, and I gradually developed 2 possible explanations, which I later shared with the other members of the team, who found them convincing. The first possibility is more conventional. Perhaps another standard meaning of gano, such as to tin or to lacquer, is closer to the intended sense. Interestingly, certain examples show that gano and the noun ganosis are sometimes used metaphorically. For instance, to illustrate the analogy between a soul clothed in virtue, thus protected from passions and vices, and copper coated with a protective layer to withstand corrosion. If ganose here means to coat, it would be consistent with both actions described in the recipe, the application of substances dissolved in vinegar or smoking the silver. In this case, the coating may consist of blackening through 2 different methods, and it seems to resonate more clearly with the smoking process, which creates a black patina of smoke on the silver surface. If this interpretation is correct, the heading is to ganose arguer could be rendered in English as to coat silver. The second possibility, which was actually the first that came to my mind, is less conventional, but I think more intriguing. It draws on 2 modern Greek terms derived from gano, the noun gana, and the verb ganiazo. Among its meanings, gana denotes the greenish rust that appears on utensils or objects that have not been galvanized. This is Babiniotis' lexicon. and more pertinently to our scope, the soot that forms on cookware used over an open flame. It should be stressed that the word derives from the verb γανώνω as a back formation. The verb γανιάζω in turn can mean to develop shoot, γάνα, or to blacken. The second meaning of γάνα and both meanings of γανιάζω align perfectly with the last sentence of the recipe, which instructs smoking the silver with a small torch if the aforementioned substances are unavailable. This suggests that both methods aim to achieve the same result, blackening. If this hypothesis holds, it indicates that at least by the time the recipe was copied, the verb γανώ, while retaining its earlier meanings, of course, may also have acquired a context-specific sense, similar to that later conveyed by the modern verb γανιάζω. In this case, the heading of the recipe could be translated as to blacken silver. While it is clear that γανώσε cannot mean to polish in this context, the choice between to coat and to blacken remains open. The former is well attested, while the latter, although compelling in terms of semantic evolution, rests on conjectural evidence drawn from modern Greek. In any case, we are much closer to a solution than we were before. This case illustrates, once again, the multifaceted value of the Greek alchemical corpus for various fields. It also highlights the crucial importance of collaboration with technical experts. Without their certainty, gained through hands-on replication, that the text could not possibly describe a polishing process, I would never have considered alternative meanings of γανώ. Thank you.
Our next talk is Hjalmar Fors. Hjalmar is a historian of science and head of 3 units at the Karolinska Institute. His research focuses on the history of empirical sciences, particularly chemistry, alchemy, pharmacy, natural history, and mining from the mid-16th to the early 19th centuries. He also explores global knowledge exchanges between Europe, China, South America, and engages in experimental history by reconstructing early modern scientific practices. His notable work, The Limits of Matter, examines the transformation of the concept of matter during the Enlightenment. So it's a pleasure to welcome you today to speak to us about embodying the experience of the past, a multisensory approach to historical pharmacy. Hjalmar, thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for a marvelous conference. It's been a great pleasure for me, who am an early modernist, to be immersed in so much knowledge which I had so little inkling about. So I have thoroughly enjoyed all these papers on aspects of history I know too little about, I realize. Another note is that I have been plundering old presentations to such an extent that it's incorrect that only my name is on this paper. I should also have the name of my close collaborator, Nils Otto Arnfeldt, here. His name will appear further on. I'll just give you a short background to where these thoughts come from. The original research project that we conducted, Nils Otto and I, was called To Reconstruct Early Modern Pharmacy. And Nils Otto has a PhD in analytical chemistry. He's a pharmacist with long experience, and I don't need to be further introduced. So this was a project that we conducted 2015 to 2018. We started out with a couple of main research questions. The most important one being, what did it mean to take a medicine? To taste, smell, and feel, think with the medicine, believe in the medicine in the early modern era. We also asked questions about the logistics of pharmacy, transport, evaluation of quality, buying, storage, the meaning of recipes and other texts, the functions in the practice of the apothecary, how medical theory was connected to the manufacture of medicaments, and also all the exotic goods. Why all these exotic goods? We knew so little. Equipment needed, how it was used. So these were kind of the questions we started with. This is Nils Otto preparing vegetable extracts at the Division of Pharmacognosy at Uppsala University. So proceeding, like many others, historical archival research, fieldwork, engagement with artifacts, relearning the gestural knowledge and reconstructing the handling conditions, questions about damp, aging of substances, maturing, and reworking. We tend to use the term reworking because we emphasize the process and also our right to fail. So at some points we have also been deliberately sloppy in our work to see what happens when you are sloppy, to see when you fail. I mean, that's the meaning of experiment. Sometimes it just goes wrong, and that's where you learn new things. And also chemical analysis of the medicines and constituent substances. And this has developed into 3 branches. Today I will talk a little bit about the experimental history of science, the experimental history of pharmacy, but I just mentioned that one of these branches was we immediately got quite a lot of attention from Swedish media. I mean, it's not that we were on television or anything, but I found all of a sudden, after we had done a long radio interview on National Public Radio, half a year later, this issue of Donald Duck appeared. And it's Donald Duck Visits Uppsala. And that's where we conducted our studies. And basically, Donald Duck and his nephews, they are doing pharmaceutical replication work at Uppsala University. In the end, they produce a marvelously good ice cream from the 17th century, which then Uncle Scrooge proceeds to sell with great profit. This is actually modeled on our work, and this is the high point of my career, I can tell you. And we also did a commercial part. We were interested in, is it possible to sell these products? And that emerged in that project, which is basically what we have been engaging in since about 2019 and up to very recently, basically producing an 18th century elixir and selling it as an alcohol, also to make it possible for people to taste and smell and actually try these products for real. And it was, of course, not possible to do this as a pharmaceutical, so instead we toned down all the medical properties quite a lot. There's a lot of laxatives in this. We need those in the commercial version. So we toned down those. And it's still, you can buy it. I think you can even buy it online. I should have brought a bottle, but I didn't check my baggage, so I couldn't do that, sorry. These questions, of course, are huge, enormous. No one can talk about them, all of them, at the same time. So this is the family of substances which we have investigated. So up in the top left corner, we have the Teriac andromacalis, the classical substance as described by Galen and many others. We have investigated how we have made the Teriac, and then we have seen how it flows into alcohols in the late Renaissance. So it becomes one of the components of various elixirs which are sold to market, as you can see here. After 1700, it develops into a product which is called Järnes Testamente, and that's the main object of our study. This product was extant in Swedish pharmacies from the 1780s to the 1980s. So we have analyzed samples of similar composition, which we have found from the 1980s. And this is the product which we have developed as a bitter or amaro from 2022. But interestingly, this product has been sold all over Europe by various traveling quacks, basically. So you have, in the English context, it's called Swedish bitters. In the Germanic context, Schwedenbitters. You have Elixir Suédois in France, and you also have Czech names for it. So absolutely, there should be a Polish version too. So this is the project, and I think one of the more interesting things we uncovered, it's not absolutely certain, is that the Italian drink Fernet Branca probably is based on this substance through the transmission part of Elixir Suédois de Toussaint de Blaise, which was developed in 1830s. So this is the kind of the main object of our investigations. So we started out in a study of experimental history of pharmacy, but we kind of ended up in a study of the history of taste and fragrance. And here you have our Theriac, the best Theriac we did, and you can see that it's a copper bowl with a tin coating on the inside following the instructions of the recipe that we used, and there we have Uncle Scrooge testing the product. So just a small recap on the classical pharmacology. As you all know, parts of plants, flowers, sap, leaves, and animals and minerals are the main things used in the classical pharmacology. We also have a continuity of tradition all the way from antiquity and before that, of course, and well into the 20th century, which is then more or less just cut short with the arrival of factory-produced medicines. We have dried, grounded, mixed, but rarely distilled and concentrated substances. It's specific production processes, and these are of course developed during early modernity when we see this development of the elixirs and also alcohol as the main carrier of the substances. You have also the situation that some substances, as we have seen in many papers today or heard in many interesting presentations, can be taken in essentially unlimited amounts. So we would regard them as foodstuffs today. Others are highly physiologically and medically active. And some, of course, or actually everything, is a poison in the wrong dosage. Saffron, Aristolochia or birthworth, nutmeg, don't grate a nutmeg and eat it. You will not like the effects. Opium. So you have these substances which are spice, but which are actually physiologically highly active substances. And this also means that this classical pharmacopoeia has a worse reputation than it deserves, because much of it actually works fine as medicine. Figs for constipation, St. John's wort for dispelling bad thoughts, thyme against cough, opium for sleeping. All of these things are still around in pharmacies today, but reworked in such a way that we don't really see the way that they connect to the plants. And here's my claim, and I think it's not so controversial. Humoral pathology rests on the assumption that sensory properties, fragrance, taste, mouthfeel, of food and pharmaceuticals are markers of the medical effect. So this is the strong connection, the strong claim which is made by this earlier tradition. Then something happens, and it's a long process. It begins already in the 12th century, perhaps even earlier, that chemistry makes its inroads into this tradition, and people become more and more dependent on chemical analysis in order to process and also understand these substances. What this means is that when we come to the late 18th century, pharmacological chemistry starts a decoupling of the sensory effect from the medical effect. This decoupling leads to a focus on the active ingredient instead of the whole plant substance. And as I said, it's a very long process which gradually closes the knowledge realm of sensory appreciation of medicinals. So we have this tradition where the senses, the body, the human, is the ultimate arbiter of truth about what is the medical effect. And that situation over the centuries, and especially during the last 200 years, has developed into a situation where our bodies are not arbiters of the truth at all. Our bodies, what matters is putting it to chemical analysis. So if we look at this, we can call it the chemical paradigm in pharmacology. It claims about sensory effects. I distinguish here between three types of things: sensory effects, physiological effects, and medical effects. So the sensory effects evoke sensory experiences, taste, odor, mouthfeel, etc. They are replaced with chemical analysis. The physiological effects which you have from these substances: sweating, trembling, evacuation, increased heartbeat, death by poisoning. These are indicative of medical effect, but they are not considered healing in themselves. And this is a big change, because in the earlier tradition, this is actually what we're after. We're after these tremblings, evacuations, sweating. That's what we're after, because, again, this is important, there is no such thing as chemical analysis. So what else could you be looking for if you do not have chemical analysis? Well, you will be looking for this. Medical effects, the healing properties that act on a beneficial way on the human body when used in a proper way of dose, as I mentioned, they are decoupled from these other two. And we have the situation which we have today, where medicines should be taken as a white pill, and we should ideally not experience the healing process in our bodies. The ideal is that it just happens, and we don't react to it by trembling or shaking or getting thirsty. That's the ideal. And this whole process then, it turns the sensory appreciation of medicaments into a lost realm. And the question then is, how do we reclaim that lost realm? And here we have Fenebranca. I really like Fenebranca. It's a good drink. I don't smoke anymore. It was better when I smoked, but it still works. So how does the meaning, I'm not paid by them in any way. How does the meaning of taste, smell, texture and color change over time, medically and commercially? And how can we describe it? How can we how can we access that sensory realm? And here we have two versions of the Swedish bitters. You have that little bottle there, which is called the Swedish bitters, and then you have the Fenebranca. So we have sensory analysis, and we developed, we relied entirely on Professor Karin Vendin at Högskolan in Kristianstad to do this sensory analysis with a trained panel of analysts. What she uses is a panel, 8 qualified assessors using an ISO standard, and they work by a consensus method. So they sit together and they discuss if you remember Sean's the test of taste from yesterday. It's similar, but it's slightly different because these are trained assessors. So they come to a common agreement. So we had all our substances, composites and also simples. We put them in test solutions and extracted them with Absolut vodka. We are Swedish after all. We had odor samples in solution also with vodka absorbed by a cotton pad. And then we had a consensus method, as I mentioned, bringing these to the test panels, and they produced these assessments. We like this method because it's safe. It's a minimum exposure. We expose to a very little substance dissolved in alcohol or in these test pads. I think this is important because we're not really working with food or spice. We're working with medicinals. So it's important to have a protocol which is safe. It also makes it possible to translate the experience of the panel to graphs. And I think this is kind of, if you go down to the bottom of science, what we do is translating stuff to scribblings on paper. That's the bottom line of translating reality to scribblings on paper. So that's important, I feel. Here's what you get. And we have here gentian root. And gentian root is one of the most bitter substances which we can think of, actually. I think it may be even the most bitter substance which is known. There are probably others. But as you can see here on these, they produce these really nice little shapes. And so you had the odor, and it's compared to wormwood. It's earthy, not so much camphor-y, but a little citrus, and then you had tea. And wormwood, of course, is the reference for being very, very bitter. So you would have this would say that it's extremely bitter. And if you look at the taste stuff, you see here that it's just bitter. There's 2 spikes here. It's bitter and wormwood, which is bitter. So you can clearly see here that you can see in graph form that, yeah, we're dealing with something which is truly bitter. And I think that's an experience which could probably translate between the centuries and even millennia. That someone during antiquity, during the Renaissance, 200 years ago, would have experienced gentian as bitter. And I think that's just an important thing to establish. With skip Chinese rhubarb, I just show you the forms here, and then we go straight for the Teriac andromacalis. And here you have an illustration of complexity. So you have the odor Teriac focusing, and then you have the various indicators. You have grapefruit, ginger, honey, vanilla, Christmas spice, wormwood again because it's bitter, camphor because it contains lots of stuff. Wet firewood is interesting, and green dry spices. And then we move into taste, and you see that it's coke candy, sweet bitter, violet, Seville orange, licorice root, camphor, and Christmas spice again. It's not so strange that people associate it with Christmas spice because it contains all the Christmas spices. This is a way of presenting the data in a way which makes it actually possible for us to translate it into these forms. And I should say we will hear much more about the manufacture of Teriac in just a few minutes, but I should just mention that the Teriac recipe that we used and worked from was from the Swedish Pharmacopoeia of 1686. That was good for us for plenty of different reasons. One of the reasons is that this is the pharmacopoeia which is most closely connected to Linnaeus and his time. So Linnaeus and his contemporaries made use of this pharmacopoeia, which made identification of substance for us a really easy task because we could go straight between Linnaeus and this book. So this is a reason why we have worked with early modern pharmacopoeias and early modern versions of Teriac rather than the ones from classical antiquity. So we started out in modern chemical analysis We wanted it to be an aid to historical method. We wanted to establish differences between materials and extracts and also explore potential contemporary uses. But we ended in something which is more like investigation of the study of not knowing, trying to use taste and smell to learn what we have forgotten. Because, and here's something which may kind of be a little bit controversial, haven't we all fallen in love too much with our analytical apparatus? Don't we go too much to chemistry to answer all kinds of questions when we should really try to consider what role our bodies play in this process? And this is the meaning for me of agnotology, the study of not knowing. What's lost, what's thrown to the roadside when we have developed all of these new fancy toys that we play with all the time? And how can we also reclaim that which has been forgotten and express it in terms which make sense to us, but also simultaneously tell us something important about the past, and also which is not accessible through the use of more traditional methods? Leave you here with these articles, which is basically most of what I said we have in these articles. And as I said, we are a multiple team, so it's Nils Otto and Karin and me.
It's a real pleasure to welcome our next speakers, Jakub Węglorz and Danuta Rai. Jakub is assistant professor at the Historical Institute of Wrocław, specializing in the cultural and medical history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth during the early modern period. And his research focuses on historical perceptions of health and disease, drawing from personal documents, diaries, letters, things like this, and leads interdisciplinary projects reconstructing historical medical recipes, of which we'll hear something today. Danuta Rai is also an assistant professor at the Department of Pharmacology and Herbal Medicines, a faculty of pharmacy in Wrocław Medical University, and her research focuses on the pharmacological properties of medicinal plants and the historical analysis of herbal remedies, and notably as well Teriak in the 17th, 18th century Poland, and has developed analytical methods for studying this. So it's a pleasure to welcome you both. Thank you so much. And you will be speaking about Teriak, retrieving the ancient, reconstructing the early modern. Please.
First of all, thank you very much for having us here. It's a wonderful opportunity and it's a marvelous conference. And we are blissfully happy to have a chance to have our papers with Hjalmar, just one after another, so we can really kind of have a discussion on the ways of perceiving reconstruction, doing Theriac and doing early modern medicines. So, the Theriac. What is actually a Theriac? One more remark. Just few hours ago, I said, don't trust the reconstructors. So please keep that in mind. It's a compound remedy with actually the longest history of use, a constant history of use. It was based and it was produced first time. It is said to be produced by the King Mithridates VI, the king of Pont, in the 3rd century BC. And it was used practically constantly until the late 19th century, although, of course, as you point out, with some changes in the recipe. The first and most important change was by the time of the Emperor Nero, made by Andromache, his physician, and he added quite a lot of ingredients. Before it was around 40, and after Andromache it was up to 70 ingredients, adding, among other, the famous viper flesh and some other substances. So the Teriac, it was designed as an antitoxic remedy. It was designed for poisoning, for being poisoned by either natural or human factors. In the early modern period, it became one of the most important and mostly used anti-epidemic remedies, used among others against pestilence, English sweat, and typhoid fevers. Due to its content of opium, it most certainly was not used as a recreational drug. Actually, what we are doing is an early modern reconstruction. So what does it have to do with the ancient drug? Early modern Teriac is a recreation of an ancient remedy. It was retrieved, it was recreated by the early modern scholars, and we are trying to reconstruct the early modern Theriac? What is the difference between reconstruction and reinventing and recreation? The scholars in early modern periods, they wanted to achieve the effectiveness of the ancient Theriac, but they were not so much interested in keeping the procedure and the ingredients as long as they were able to get the goal. So basically, as long as they would have the assumed effectiveness that they loved in the ancient Teriak, they would go for any substitutes that were available. So this is why the early modern Teriak is not a continuity and it's not a reconstruction of the ancient one. It is reinvented, it is remade. And this way of thinking is illustrated by the protocols, the list of equivalencies, the qui pro quo descriptions in the early modern literature, which proves that they were really easygoing on replacing some ingredients as long as they will get the effect that they wanted to get. An example of such attitude is a leaflet, a short book by Tidicius written in the Royal Prussia, and it shows the list of possible substitutes, and the booklet has got two main topics. The first is panegyric on the virtues of Teriac, how good it is, and what could you actually achieve with each of the ingredients. And the second thing that the booklet keeps in mind and shows you is that there are fake Theriacs because of unreliable raw materials. So it shows you that if you use the proper things, then you'll get the proper Teriac. So this leads us to the question, what is an original Teriac, or whatever original production raw materials in the early modern period? So nowadays, when we think about generics, then these are the copy drugs, the substitutes for brand name drugs, but they should have the same active ingredients, the same compounds, and they should have comparable effects on your body. But in the early modern periods, they would have pretty much the same idea, but they would more focus on the effectiveness and not on the same ingredients. So they would use different ingredients as long as they had the effectiveness they were about to. It's hard to say whether these raw materials that they exchanged, whether they were generic or original, because this is the way that the science accepted such exchange. So, and our Teriac recipe, it originates from Torun, the German Torun, Polish Torun, and dates back to 1630. And this is the oldest printed Teriac prescription in Royal Prussia. As you can see, it has a very official form. It was printed and accepted by the Thuringian authorities. And this led to a kind of a Cold War and a race between officials and between the major cities of the region to assert their role and their importance in the Teriac production, as it led to fame, respect, and quite a lot of money, because it was a very lucrative business to produce the Teriac. So the moment the first recipe was published, very soon many other were published in the region, and it started kind of a race of arms. This leaflet was printed in Latin in the form of a single side print, and it was prepared by the Paweł Gudiniusz, an apothecary who was officially licensed to produce Teriac. He had his apprenticeship in Württemberg in 1609. And after that, he came back to Torun, and the authorities gave him permission to produce his own Teriac. We've selected this recipe because, first of all, it's the oldest in the region. Secondly, there are municipal records that prove that it has been made and it has been used, among others, during the epidemics in the 17th century. So this specific recipe had many, let's say, customers and patients that it was used by. And to recreate the combined preparation, which are included in the Teriac, because there are quite a lot of raw materials which are going to be shown in a moment. That's not my job. We also used the dispensatory by Valerio Cordo, which was the most popular in the region. So if we had some combined preparation that was not explained in the recipe, we will take the explanation from Cordus. What was the cost of the Teriac? So first of all, it was quite an expensive drug, because 1 drachm is about 4 silver groszy, which is quite a lot, but it's not only the Teriak, it's also the spirit, the acid, the waters. So you have many other products that you can sell in your apothecary, which were also pretty expensive, and you couldn't get it like in a grocery store. They didn't sell it on hand. You would have to buy a special tin container, which was also pretty expensive, taking into consideration that it can hold only few drachm of the product, although we think it could be reused more than once, so you don't have to buy a container each time you go to the pharmacy, to the apothecary. So anyway, this is quite an expensive drug. The cost of production is estimated for 2 groszy per drug. How did we estimate it? According to the official taxes, official price list, and the list of all the ingredients altogether would cost about 2 groszy, and the selling price is 4. The selling price is 100% higher than the price of the ingredients. To compare, the 4 groszy is the equivalent of about 5 kilograms of wheat by that time in the city, and 6 groszy is the price of a goose. So again, we are going to show you the dosage, but 1 drachm is a therapeutic dose for one time, and you would probably need to use it more than once. So it was quite an expensive therapy. About the ingredients, Dankai is more qualified to tell you about that.
At first, it's like 72 individual ingredients. It depends how you count it, because it's not so easy to count. But the simples, there are 61 and 3 combined preparations. And I have to tell you that it took us 4 years to get all of these things, because, well, initially we thought like we've got the internet after all. So we can Google. It's all in our fingertips, and it turned out that it's not. Some of those compounds that you can see were pretty easy, like St. John's wort, easily bought from pharmaceutical company. I saw the Galka company being employed in your Teriac preparation, because I know the label, so that's the case. And for cinnamon, Ceylon cinnamon, cassia cinnamon, saffron, all were pretty easy. With vipers, we employed forestry workers who were finding the dead, run-over animals. There is a parasitic plant next to the viper, the yellow one, it's Cytinus hypocystis, which was pretty difficult to obtain, but our fellow scientists from Sardinia managed to find it, because it's a parasite on cistus roots, and you can find it in the spring, let's say, in the region. But we had a lot of problems with gathering all the compounds. Sometimes we had to just go to the exotic, esoteric websites and imagine presenting your university with an invoice labeled with pure magic and so on. They were pretty crazy at the beginning with that. And then we had to employ like filmmakers or missionaries to get us the grass from Uganda, because it was the lemongrass, not the Asian one, but the African one, and it grows right now in Central Africa. But, well, yeah, we finally managed. 2 of the compounds actually have toxic effects in humans. It's opium and the squill. And what more we can say, that most of the ingredients are aromatic, because the whole idea of the Teriac was to burn the toxins within the body. So the Teriac was contraindicated in high fevers, because they considered it a lethal threat for a person that had a fever to burn internally. And the taste could be, if someone tried it, very pungent, very aromatic, like showing you that the medicine is working, which is to the sensory perceiving of the drug, what Hjalmar taught. What we can find in historical sources about dosage, it's the 3 drugs considered a serious overdose, while 1 is acceptable therapeutical dose, and it was the higher dose noted in the sources. For prophylaxis, a single dose of the size of a pea. So the counting we have like 4.9 milligrams of morphine for the highest recorded single dose, which is about half of the dose of the standard painkiller, orally taken morphine as a painkiller. With squill, we've got 58 milligrams of processed squill, while 3 grams of fresh squill, which should be more toxic, is not considered toxic dose at all. And the ginger is like present in 11 milligrams, but the vast majority of the dose is honey itself because it's the most compound. Just saying that orally you should take 200 milligrams of morphine to start the recreational dosage. So we've got like 50 times less, we are below the dose. And the expected effect, an antidiarrheal effect, it's confirmed in historical sources. It was like testing if it is a genuine Teriac, and it should be really expected. We've been expecting some antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory activity in tests. But at the present, like on theoretical level, there is no evidence that Teriac is anything more than a placebo.
So it is actually a reconstruction. Well, basically, as you probably all know, it's a rudimentary thing that reconstruction is a process of recreating, restoring, rebuilding a thing when the whole object or the part of the object is missing. So it's always only an approximation. It's reconstruction. We don't get the same object. We are recreating it. So it is impossible to obtain the identical object because there are many undefined variables that we do not follow. But on the other hand, it is important to keep in mind that in the past the results of a craftsman's work was also not always reproducible. So it was repeatable. We can assume that one craftsman doing one activity would be in some way repeatable. But when you pass the recipe to another craftsman, then it's little probable that he will have the exact same effects. And this is the case that we like to use the recipe for pastries. If you do pastries or you do stew or whatsoever, and it tastes the way you like it, and then you pass the recipe to someone else and he follows the recipe, but it doesn't really taste exactly the same. The stew or the pastries will be utterly different, even if they are really very carefully following the recipe. So we can assume that although we are not super exact and we are not getting the identical object, they didn't get it either. Our research today is focused on recreating the early modern recipe, which is both the reenactment of the procedure and the reconstruction of the final effect. So we try to keep the compliance with the early modern methods of working, methods of doing stuff in the apothecary. So we proceed with the accordance to the methodology developed in the early modern era and not necessarily to what nowadays current phytochemical and pharmaceutical industry will tell us to do. So sometimes we don't want to get the same pharmaceutical effect, we want to get what they would follow and use the methods they would feel more applicable. So the reconstruction of historical remedies is both the translation of composition and the translation of the process.
I must say that as a pharmacist I had to unlearn a lot of things to attempt this reconstruction. I mean, the drive at the very beginning to follow the extractability of some certain compounds which I knew about was so strong that we had to discuss over and over again how to get rid of this attitude, because otherwise we would be driven towards modern pharmaceutical industry, not the recreation itself. So what we had to do, we had to translate the composition, and it was from early modern Latin, and we had to translate it into contemporary laboratory protocol, because we made it in a laboratory. So the first thing we had Preliminary nomenclature, we had traditional apothecary names, alchemical symbols. Now we are talking more general about reconstructions of medicines. There is an obvious mismatch between historical and contemporary terminology. So, some words just changed their meaning. We had a problem with cardamom because we had it on the list and it was cardamom. This is an easy piece and Teriac cardamom, not a problem. But then we found out that we've got Amomifructus. And what is an Amomifructus? And we had to consult botanical sources from the time, and it turned out that Amomifructus is actually Teriac cardamom. So it turned out that we have two times Eleutheria cardamomum under two different names in the recipe. So it means that we perhaps have misunderstood the cardamom, that it wasn't a cardamom. And it turned out that at that time in Europe, cardamom was in fact grains of paradise, Aphramum melegueta, closely related plant, but from Africa, from Central Western Africa. And then the name turned to Eleutheria cardamomum for supply chain reasons.
Tastes different.
Yeah, and it doesn't have a scent. What else did we have to translate? The process, of course, and how should we prepare the remedy? The best thing is when you have notes like protocols. Then you turn to dispensatoria, pharmacopoeias, then you compare with similar forms of medicine. In case you lack totally any clue, you can just go to the 19th century manuals, which can be to some point helpful. What we have to be careful is pharmaceutical common sense, because our common sense is totally different from their common sense, and it can work only in a very, very basic things that we do. So the notes can be misleading, sometimes intentionally. Sometimes we are not sure which part of the plant is the one being used. So, well, when we attempted actually to do this reconstruction, we have just gathered all the compounds. That's a third of compounds. And how do we do then? We use museum objects. We used this copper vessel with a wooden pestle, and I saw it's very similar to your reconstructions. You also used this type of... It was from a Museum of Pharmacy, and all hails to them that they allowed us to use this. Custom-made devices. Like this one, it's a Moorhead, a very efficient distillery device. Some simple, low-budget utensils. Here we are baking our Stilla bulbs. This is how it looked baked. And this is a compound medicine to use to histichedichroi, or how it should be pronounced. We were using silicone forms. And we tried to model the humidity factors and distributions of heat with our contemporary laboratory. I had a problem with working without gloves here and with regular clothes, but that's how we wanted to keep it close to the original as possible. This is not for Teriac, but this is how we made this circulation device, the Pelican, with silicone hosing that served as a pressure check for us, because we weren't sure how far can we heat the closed glass vessel, but yeah, this is something we really liked. You can see some of these reconstructions are really appealing, like I could just gaze at it for an hour. And we are at the end of the presentation.
Okay, to sum up, so is it a reconstruction or is it a construct? So recreating old medicaments always encounters some difficulties. It's the workshop and the source analysis. They are difficult. You have to interpret the text, which can lead you to some problems. You have to understand the recipe, not only linguistic, but also on semantic level. You have to understand the old scientific language, which can be, again, misleading because some words has changed their meaning. And you have to reproduce the process correctly. So and sometimes it is impossible to determine exactly how such drug was produced, and then you have to kind of get as close as possible. And these are the pictures of Teriac that we were producing. So what I wanted to stress out is, as we understand that we are not really exactly copying the early modern Teriac, they were not able to repeat the same procedures either, because they were craftsmen and they didn't use the quantitative methods of measurement. So we were reconstructing early modern Teriac, which was a retrieved ancient drug. So reconstructing a recreation of a retrieved drug is kind of complicated, but I hope you got the general idea of what was it all about. So thank you very much.
Many thanks for all of you for your nice presentations. I really enjoyed a lot. I have a comment, not just a question, I have a comment about what is taste, what is flavor, and what is aroma. So there's the three terms that it's really different, and you talk about really well in your QDA of quantitative analysis of in your sensory training. So taste is something that is just related with the 5 tastes, so salty, bitter, sweet, etc., umami. And flavor is all the things that you could perceive in your mouth, so aroma and taste, texture and hearing. So and aroma is always related with volatile compounds that you could feel it in your nose, even retronasal or orthonasal. So this is the clarification. So that's why you could find it in your descriptors in the spider diagram, bitterness and warmth. So this is clarification for that. Thanks a lot.
I'm not the taste scientist, but I also know that I simplified a little bit because there was a lot of material to be running through.
Thank you all. I have a question for I think Danuta. I was wondering if you can give me an example of what you mean by the scientific language. I mean, the fact that you had to translate the term into the modern scientific language. So something that's from the Latin, and how did you translate it in modern terms? If you can think some, like on top of your head. Thank you.
One was do it according to the art. It was a common thing that was written with the recipes, and we were looking for what does it mean according to the art, and it meant there was one specific recipe when it was clarified that do not burn. It was the first thing when it was clarified. The other is like distill. You have like compounds and you have distill, and then you have to decide: do you distill it dry or do you distill it with solvents? Because it's not clear, and it's not always it's clear. Then, which device would you use? What's temperature to which you should like heat it? Do you heat it until it burns? Do you heat it until it's like? There is a lot of factors which you need to decide on the reconstruction level. So that's the moment of translation of procedure.
Okay, in that sense, in the sense that you have a word which is actually generic, and then you have to somehow try different way, because heating is not just heating, could be okay. That's what you mean when you mean to translate it into scientific language.
Yeah,
Okay.
laboratory language. That would be more.
Okay. So just basically you need to be precise.
More or less.
Because
yeah.
if it's heating, I mean, it can be heating, right? If it's heat in the Latin, that's heating even in no language. I mean.
Sometimes it's that the drug itself tells you some hints about it. It was with extraction for Silopus violaris. And we had those little tiny flowers of viola, and the protocol mentioned that you have to, the temperature must be hot, not not boiling, but hot. And what temperature is hot, and what does it mean? And it turned out that we have overheated it once, so all the anthocyanins that are responsible for the color just they bleached totally, and everything was white. So we knew that like 65 degrees is too much, and then we lowered very much temperature below 50, and the extraction didn't go on. So it was like about 55 degrees that the extraction was pretty well, and they were stable. So
now we know what is hot.
So now we know what is hot.
Okay. But you don't have any indication, for example, of heating with water, like mild fire or low fire? Or,
sometimes it is, yes. For Teriac it was on coals, on like not very hot coals, but medium. Like I don't remember how it was exactly named, but well, we translated it to the low heat.
Okay, thank you.
Isabel, please. And it's just before, if anyone has any questions, put your hand up at any time, and I'll just take your name down. I'm keeping the list. Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you very much for all three fascinating papers. And my point or my remark goes to Gerasimos, which linguistic approach. I think it's very valuable also for the medical things and the medical texts, because we can see there in it not only the ambiguity and the duality of the meanings, but we can also see that the development of linguistics is very crucial to the understanding of these texts, and exactly this is what we also have in medical texts and the development of medical language. And there's a very good article by Tina Lendari and Cristina Cazzicavelli about the language of medical texts and Iatosofia in special, which answers to this what you were saying, that we also need to look into the linguistic development and also into modern Greek. So this is very good. Thank you very much.
I had a question for Hjalmar, because I found your presentation very interesting. I just wanted to ask, in an ancient medical receipt, it's common to describe the preparation of drugs on pharmaca, describing the smell of preparation, the taste of a preparation. Is something common in a medical recipe or not?
It's not.
It's not. Yeah, because even in medical recipe it's uncommon, but it could that to be central, I think.
Mike, this is precisely my point, that we look at the recipes, we study the texts over and over again, but as soon one of our epiphanies, to speak of it in that way, was when we had placed a massive order with the firm Galkes, and we were permitted by the pharmacologist to store all of this in a room of our own, and then we locked the door to the room, and then we returned, and the room just smelled. There was this enormous fragrance coming out of it. All of the room just, and the whole department basically ran there like, oh, wonderful, what's this? What's happening in this place? In that moment, we realized that the early modern pharmacy is a place where you have a fragrance. And this we see clearly also in sources where you have inspection protocols made by when the doctors go out and inspect the pharmacies. There, in that kind of documentation, you clearly see the importance of smell, because they do go up to containers, and then they check the containers, and then they say, the herbs are too old, they're moldy, and there's no smell to them. The Chinese rhubarb isn't functioning because you cannot have the pungent fragrance. So in that kind of testing document, you see that it's really important. So I mean, this is the aspect which is silenced by the sources because it's obvious.
Okay.
And that is the reason that we are so concerned with reconstructing it and presenting it to a contemporary people in a way that makes it comprehensible.
Thank you.
Before we go to the next question, which is Effie's, Jakub is going to pass around the Theriac reconstruction, so you can smell briefly while we're talking. Effie, please.
May I ask something to the procedures? That sometimes we even have notes just saying us what to do, but we cannot interpret it on the first thought in the right way. And it was like with this copper vessel, and we had explicitly told that it should be a copper vessel for a certain stage of production of Teriac with wooden pestle.
Same for us.
Yeah, and we are hypothesizing why. I mean, do they need like copper ions or something? Well, I'm a pharmacist, so I immediately like go into these chemical trace. I cannot help it. And why the wood? And then we realized when we were making it. So at first it was at Bain-Marie, so the copper vessel was the most suitable one to use for this heating in a bath. And the pestle had to be wooden because otherwise it would harm the vessel. You cannot work with stone or iron pestle within the copper vessel because, well, you just don't. It just doesn't work that way. So it's not always necessarily the product-oriented some factors that are mentioned in the recipe. Sometimes they are just process-oriented.
And the copper didn't stick to the Teriac itself. It was easier to smear it and to kind of get it off the vessel. So obviously it was just comfortable to use.
Actually, two questions, one for Gerasimos and one for yourselves. I'll start with Gerasimos. The Idatos Theoevresis. I wonder if they were really trying, they may have been trying to emulate steam emanating from solfataras, from volcanic landscapes. Because if you go to Milos, if you go to Nisiros, if you go to Campi Flegrei, you will have instantly in front of you steam coming up.
Never thought of it.
And they would form a puddle. There will be naturally a puddle. The water will collect. So the theon and the sulfur. We actually gave a talk talking about divine theon based on these solfataras. So I think you have a theme running there, which we can discuss afterwards. Because if they're trying to emulate that environment, and they can't necessarily go to Milos or Nisiros to get it, then what they're actually showing in the recipe is very much doable, meaning they could end up. And
it is anyway.
Sorry?
It is doable. It is feasible, as I have shown. But you mean over the volcano or near the volcano? Not over the volcano, of course, near the volcano.
No, I mean, I can discuss it with you afterwards, but it's the microbial element that joins all of them together. And in a sense, a particular type of bacteria that live in the solfataras, but they also live in the urea. So, it's the theme that binds them together.
But you know, the thing is that we have several variations of creating divine water, which does not always contain sulfur.
Doesn't have to. That's what I'm saying to you.
Okay.
That doesn't have to.
Is lime enough instead of sulfur?
No, the urea is enough.
But can we have it with lime?
I don't know. I can only speculate. But
thank you for this. Yes.
So if I can ask you, did you actually say that the Theriac was a placebo?
Yes.
Well, just based on the theoretical analysis, because we haven't just attempted, it's just being measured right now, so we don't have tests, laboratory tests, how it can, what activity it can have, versus Yersinia or not. And the preliminary tests support the general view that every single compound present in Theriac is in too low quantity in single dose to perform activity, like on the pharmaceutical level of analysis. Now, we were hoping for some synergies to appear.
But what are you testing them for? Are you testing as in the microbial
The
and the fungal?
microbially, the first tests are just purely phytochemical, to see if the compounds that we know that are active, did they survive the whole process of, because it was fermented. The important stage of maturing Teriac for a whole year, which is just described in sources, is that there is a fermentation stage. So we cannot just predict what's going to happen with such complex metrics. After fermentation, we have to test it. So there are some possibilities for synergies to occur, but based on on theoretical analysis of what's put in, what are the doses, and so on, the doses are too low of every single compound to be effective.
And did you have a mineral component in there, or was it all plant? What was your mineral?
It was it was copper and ferric. Like vitriol.
Sulfate.
Sulfate.
Yeah.
And
Can I just add something to this? We in our Teriak we have tentatively arrived at the same conclusion that yes, it's unlikely that it has any clear medical effects at all similar to early modern claims about what it does. But this said, I think that it's absolutely crucial to remember that our modern notion of what is a placebo is extremely different from the early modern, and I would presume the classical and medieval notion of how things actually work to achieve a healing effect. So I think that when we say placebo, we must expand placebo and also include magic. We must include a lot of other things into that. And that means that when we say placebo, we think of it as something which isn't really functional, but it is functional in a very, very efficient way. And imagine if you take a placebo effect and you put it in a context where it will be, all the authorities will point towards your placebo effect. You will have smell, you will have fragrance, you will have taste, you will have the symbolic situation, you would have a liturgy basically surrounding the preparation of the substance. There's so many aspects of this, and in the case of Teriak there is that liturgy where it's symbolically produced in a public setting. So all of these combined factors would kind of hypercharge the placebo effect in a way which we cannot replicate.
Just one more word, like Hjalmar said, because if you ask the guys from the laboratory, they will hide behind the analyzers. But basically, long story short, the question, did it work? Well, in the sense that they wanted it to work, in the early modern scientific sense, yes, obviously it worked. It heated up your humors, you could feel it is really warming up your mouth. It worked 100%. Did it kill Yersinia? No, obviously not. Was it antimicrobial? No. So, how to answer the question, did it work? In the early modern sense, obviously. In the evidence-based medicine nowadays sense, no, rather not.
And just to add a little bit extra to that, and of course the early moderns were painfully aware that Teriak did not stop plague in its tracks. Of course they were. Of course they knew that.
I think we need to do a bit of soul searching here as to what the concept of poison was, because they had no words, or at least not the words we have today. So plague is really poison by invisible source. Air. It is poison in the air that I can't exactly get my hands onto where exactly that poison is. If I get a wound, I can see the arrow through my hand and it's completely clear. If somebody feeds me with arsenic, I know exactly. But I deal with one of those controversial materials in antiquity, and which has been called placebo many times. And I think that if I don't know how to answer my question of how to define poison, all right? But the point is that it has an effect on the immune system. That is a fact. What is it? What is the effect? What is the mechanism of that? I can't tell you, because it is it has to be examined on a point. All I'm trying to say, we need to keep a very open mind, because we can't understand the language. and the language of what is perceived as poison versus venom, what is ingested, what is injected. It's a whole world out there that we are not on top of.
Yeah, sure, but on the other hand, they are quite specific, and they will tell you exactly how you can get pestilence, and it's in the air, but it also could be on your doors, on your how do you call it, glass, or so they give you quite a lot of explanation, and yeah, of course, these words are different than the ones we use, but if you go deep enough, then there's more or less a general idea of how they understood.
But they don't know the microbial world, though. They don't.
No, they didn't need to.
I think at this
They
point
they never looked for microbial.
No,
They would say
it was impossible for them.
I know I shouldn't really continue this discussion. We are now approaching, which is the precise reason why I think it's important for us. It could be a good idea for us late moderns to abandon all our concepts of medical effects. We just drop them, unless, if we are after historical understanding, if we are after the aim of seeing what we can call the ethnopharmacological aim of examining the substances to find out what the effects are in modern terms, then yes, we should continue on that path. But if our aim is historical understanding, we should probably just completely drop all our ideas about how medicine works and medical effects, and just think about the physiological. Because I think that's the key to start to understand, to get the understanding of medicine as grounded in the body rather than in the analysis. So and that's my view.
I think this is an incredibly rich topic, actually, and I think that this is something that we will obviously keep coming back to throughout the years. So thank you for ending on this.